and welcome to Our People, the podcast where we give space for Holdeman Stories. We focus on hope, healing, and inspiration. Connection, consciousness, and love are the driving motivations for this project. Remember to have grace for those who have chosen to speak out and share their experience. Please enjoy the story you will hear today. Hi, and welcome to Our People, where we give space for ex-Holdeman stories. I am Weylin Unruh, and I'm here today with Nolan Raber. Nolan, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Nolan Raber. I was born, I'm 35 now, so I was born a while ago. I was born down in Ohio. So my grown up years were, my first 8 years were there in Ohio. I grew up in the Kidron, Ohio congregation. So I think I was 8 when we left, so I would have been in grade 2, I think, when we moved north and we moved to the Crooked Creek, Alberta congregation. My parents, my dad is from Ohio there. It's a little bit interesting. I think we've had one other person here on the podcast that I listened to anyway that said she was from that area as well. And so like my family on that side is all Amish background. My dad's parents joined from I think it was the Old Order Amish. So that congregation, it's a very, very rule-based, from my experience, very strict congregation. And then moving up here in grade 2, obviously that wasn't something I was so aware of, but coming up here, the culture is very different. I think people are a lot more just open, and the rules, the society is different. Grandpa came up here. I think Grandpa and Grandma came up here from, I think, BC. Well, Grandma was from Manitoba somewhere. Anyway, they were the homesteaders in the area, or would have been of the homesteading group. And so starting from little to nothing, the society or the group is it's a different way of life. So that's kind of where I'm from. We lived here, let me think. We lived here till I was in grade 9. So I would have been about 15. And then we moved back down to Ohio for a couple of years. Mom and Dad built a new house down there. And then I decided when I was 18 to move back up here. I guess I didn't feel like I really fit in with the group down there. And I think moving at that age is a bit tough for kids. So I came back up here when I was 18, and I've lived here ever since. So that's a brief overview of that part of my life. I have some memories from back, maybe that first part, that I kind of wanted to touch on. Not sure what order to do this in. I think some of this that influenced my decision, like ultimately I left the Holdeman Church for a multitude of reasons. I'm not sure where to go from here. So I guess what I'm thinking right now is I have a note here talking about one of my earliest memories is a memory of a bunch of suits sitting at the bottom of the stairs in the house I was in when I was a little kid, and my mom was just crying in that group, and and I think that's had an impact on how I felt about the church and how I felt about authority in general, um, over the years. It's not a pleasant memory, and I don't know what the conversation was. I don't really know any of that, but that's just that memory has stuck with me, and it's like I don't tend to trust. Maybe that's something along those lines. I think is what's going on there. Um, yeah. So, oh, I guess another little anecdotal story I think of before I about the time. Let me think here. I would have probably been 16 or 17 at the time this happened. Yeah, I was 17 actually. And we were over at, well, when we moved back down to Ohio for the second time, we moved to a different congregation to Scenic Ridge. And um, the preacher there, he set up this little game, and it was so awkward. It was it was one of those games. He's like, so I'm gonna be the judge, and you're gonna be the COs, like as if we were going to war. And I don't know exactly what was in his head, why we needed to do this. I, I can assume that maybe he wanted to put a little fear in the hearts of us sinful youth boys. That's kind of what I got from it. But regardless, um, so there was several of us that were kind of. He might have viewed us as a little bit fence riders at the time. I think. I mean, I had a couple CDs. I think that was probably the most egregious sin I had committed to that point. Maybe I'd watched a couple movies. Um, Regardless, he set this up, and then so he started with some of the older boys, and they gave their really good reasons in his books as to why they couldn't be um, part of the war effort, and so he would let them pass. And then one of the guys that I hung out with a little bit at the time, he just said, "Well, my parents don't think I should be allowed to go to war, and uh, my pastor also doesn't think it's a good idea." And the preacher there, who was being the judge, he was like, "Well, that's not really good enough. Do you got anything else?" And Wes was just like, "Nope, no, I got nothing." And he just repeated the same thing over again. And preacher's just like, "Oh, you're gonna have to go to war, I guess." And then I thought it was funny because Wes comes up and he's like, "Well, here's the thing. This is actually the true story. Uh, one of the COs did, in fact, say this, and he was, in fact, the judge admitted that he was legit in his concern, and he didn't actually make him go to war." And the pastor just did not really fully appreciate that that humor at the time. So then I think after Wes, it was my turn, except that he turns to me, he's like, "Well, what about you, Nolan?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not old enough to go to war. I'm 17." And the crestfallen look on his face was entirely worth it for me.
Yeah.
So that's just one of those stories where he was and I believe still is quite a hardliner in that church. And it is actually him that was involved with eventually excommunicating my parents as well, which plays into my story later on. So I don't know if there's really. I mean, I remember. Okay, so I have a couple notes here. I'm just reading. I remember talking. So when we moved down there, I was 15-ish, and I remember talking to one of my buddies down there, and he never joined. And we had talked about the church, right? Like, what's going on here? What's this look like? We both liked our music a little bit, and we couldn't really see what the issue was with some of that stuff, and we just couldn't see it. So that's probably about the time I would have been 16-ish when I started having some real questions about what's going on in this church. What's happening here? Like, I got baptized at probably, I don't remember, 12 or 13, kind of a little later than most of my friends, but not way late. So it was pretty normal. I was incredibly fearful one night, and that was that. I found peace, as they like to say, and that's that. And it's like, well, it's not really much of an experience, to be honest. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just kind of unfortunate. I think that's it's all it to me. Looking on it now, it's like it's this whole thing is just based on fear, and yeah, I think that misses the point a bit. But um,
Mhm.
so I moved back up here, and I I managed to kind of fly under the radar quite a bit. I kind of did what I wanted to. Come revival times, I'd, like many Mennonite kids, I would get rid of my. I owned, you know, the same CD many times,
Yeah.
and only if you're Holdeman do you really understand that scenario. But revivals would come, and I would clean up, and then a month or two later, or three, I would be back to buying another set. Um, so during that time, I also enjoyed the occasional beer here and there with friends or something like that. Um, I was, not sure exactly what order this all happened in, but I was probably, well, 19 or 20. And we would, I went out with my buddies, friends, whoever occasionally. Um, but there came a point where I was like, okay, so I've gotten pretty sloshed here. I should probably confess this, and they're gonna kick me out, and I don't really want to deal with that anymore. So I'm done. Like I'm leaving this group. So I went to one of the preachers there in Crooked Creek, and I told him, the whole thing. I kind of spilled my guts. I was like, I've been drinking, got pretty drunk. Um, Probably should kick me out. And he was like, well, and I told him also, I was like, I don't, I don't think I can come back. Like I think I'm done. Um, and he's like, well, I think maybe you could find grace for that yet. Like, I think you should go home and pray about that. And so I did. Like I took it very seriously, and I went home and I prayed about it. And oh, I thought like, oh yeah, I felt okay about it. So preacher said it was okay. I'm okay. It was kind of fine. And they left me
Mhm.
alone for another year and a half, maybe two. I don't remember exactly how long it was. Um, but it was a while. Um, and then in that time period, I met a girl that I was interested in, and um, I, I think I'd went to tech college at that point as well, for a couple of years, and I had also kind of had a few beers again, like I had,
Yeah.
done before, and it was just kind of that was something I enjoyed doing with some of the friends I had. Um, but I was thinking about getting married, and I'm sitting there going, hmm, I don't, I don't. I'd seen guys or couples or whatever get married and then get expelled, and I didn't always understand why. Like they're very opaque with how they do things, and so I was like, I wasn't actually sure what it was for, and it seemed like sometimes whatever. So I was like, you know what, I'd rather get expelled now than get married and
Mhm.
then have to get kicked out later and then make a whole schmoz of it, right? So I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna, make sure that I have my T's crossed and my I's dotted. I'm gonna go talk to them about it, and
Right.
then clear it up. Well, so happened that the preacher I had talked to previously wasn't available. I went and talked to the old guy at the congregation at the time, and he didn't think there was grace for this. This was just a bridge too far. Now, I also, I had not been, I should maybe clarify, I had been pretty clear with them, and in both cases, the previous time I had gotten very drunk. This time, 4 beers, 5 maybe, I don't know. It wasn't a lot. And I have friends that were with me and that will confirm this. And in fact, now in hindsight, the friend that I was mostly drinking with, he brought the same thing to them later on, not knowing that I had gotten expelled for this. And he told them that, and they're like, I don't think that's enough. So in my case, even though we'd been drinking together, in my case, I had went too far. In his case, because he wanted to leave, he hadn't went far enough. So what I found in that time, that I found that very, very hard. I still fully believed the system. I still fully believed, like I guess I believed when I got expelled for that, then I believed that I was lost. Like that's what they teach.
Right.
That's what I believed. And so that was really, really hard. Like I don't really wish that on my worst enemy. Like that was a really dark time for me. But in hindsight, to me, it just looks like control and manipulation. That's honestly all I really see with that is the desire to control me. And with their knowledge that I wasn't going to leave, they're like, oh, well, let's teach him a lesson. So maybe that wasn't their goal, but I have my questions. So that was another one of those marks where I was like, okay, that's weird. A little while later, I think it was after I'd been expelled. I think it's been a few years ago. I went to boys' class. Me and a friend. We went down to Oklahoma, and we both were a bit on the same page. We both had our questions about the church, but we were like, okay, this is something they teach. Let's go down here. Let's learn. And this is supposed to give us the answers. Great. Let's go get the answers. Well, we both, when we went down there, didn't feel like the answers were given us. When we got into some of the topics that we had questions about, the class leader, the preacher, just shut them down, read literally off of his notes, and said, this is what the church has decided. This is it. So I don't know if we were staying together, but we did talk during class some when we weren't with a bunch of other people. And we were just like, so the questions we have are getting shut down. And then we know what's happening or what's coming here is we have to make this commitment to the church. And we're like, well, what are we going to do? And I think we got into more depth talking about that later because we didn't talk about it a lot there, but afterwards we're like, we're stuck. If we don't commit, there's a target on our backs as soon as we get home.
Right.
So not only has he not answered our questions, we're going to be targeted as soon as we get home. So we felt very trapped by that system at that time. And we both looked at it and said, well, we're going to say what needs to be said because what else are we going to do? Might not be the
Mm-hmm.
truth, but if we want to have any hopes of getting married in the Holdeman church, which is where all our friends are,
Yeah.
this is what we got to do. So we did. But in all honesty, I don't know if it was to assuage our consciences or what it was at the time, but we, as soon as we got back in Canada, we stopped for a few brewskis at one of the places, because we're just like, something ain't right here. This isn't a good thing. So that was my experience of the boys class. It was just kind of another one of those things. It's like, something's wrong here. Somewhere in this time, I had also been informed of or run across Vivian Stoppel's website, and that didn't help assuage my questions. In fact, it only made them quite a bit more bigger for me, is what I'm looking to say.
Yeah.
So and I guess the big thing in that website that still stood out to me is she has this list of the one true churches, and I don't remember which all it was, but I do remember that it was the Catholic Church, Jehovah's Witness, the Mormons, and I think there was a couple others, mostly smaller than those. And when I thought about that, I'm like, okay, so, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be Catholic. I certainly think the Mormon Church is in the wrong spot, and Jehovah's Witness really isn't much different. I'm like, I wouldn't join any of those three. Who's to say that my church has this doctrine right? So for me, that was probably the one big item on the website that I was like, that's a real red flag. So this was all prior to me getting married.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was 22 when we got married. Oh, before I go any further, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention. And I guess this one here, I think it's pretty common, but I've brought this instance up to a counselor before. I've never fully worked through it, but I think it's worth noting that my experience was, before getting baptized in the Holdeman Church, they like to take usually one young kid at a time, 12, 13, whatever you are, down, and they have a talk about sex in the basement of the church. That was my experience, was two older suits and me in a little Sunday school room in the basement.
Wow.
I today, if some preacher from my church took one of my daughters at 13 down in the basement and had a sex talk with them, there would be major issues. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
That would not fly. I don't know if that's still going on, but I personally think that is highly inappropriate. Anyway, so moving on, I was roughly around 20. I think I was 22 when, like I said, I was 22 when we got married, roughly. Oh, and the girl I married was from Manitoba, so I knew her family a little bit. I didn't know her very well. I kind of did the proper Mennonite thing. We didn't know each other very well. We'd met a couple times. And she was from a very staunch family. That I knew. Like, she dressed very conservatively. Her family was very conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And with where I was at the time, with all the questions I had, I thought, well, I have questions. she's really staunch, her family's really staunch. Potentially, this is going to, cement me in the faith. I was like, maybe these people know something I don't, right? So we got married. But one thing I had done is I had subscribed to a publication called Voice of the Martyrs. I don't actually know if they still exist or not, but they are a group that follows Christians throughout the world that are in countries where Christianity is not allowed. And there's quite a few of these people, or quite a few of these countries, shockingly many, or there was at the time. And these people are dying because they're Christian. So I had subscribed to that. I was getting it in the mail. I found the stories interesting. And I just left it laying around on the counter, just like any other publication that I read, right? One day my wife sits down and starts reading it, and she's like, what in the world? What is this? And I'm like, yeah, this is what it is. It's Christians across the world that are getting killed for their faith. And I think we all kind of know, like, the Holdemans, being the one true church, all those martyrs in the martyr's mirror are their martyrs, or at least they kind of have ownership of it.
yeah, exactly.
So when she realized this disconnect, she started having questions as well. She's like, well, I didn't know this was a thing. I was like, oh, okay. So sounds like she's got more to learn than I do here. Interesting. All right. Well, this is what it is, right? So we did at that time, we joined a local Bible study. Her sister, who also lived in that congregation, was attending it was kind of a hush hush thing, I think, because the Holdemans don't really approve of this, but we joined a Bible study that was separate. I think Cam was a part of that one. I don't think he would care if we talked about that at the time. So there was a few of us Holdemans that were also attending this, and then there was a few from the local church as well. And I think we went through like Galatians. I don't remember exactly, but that didn't help lessen my questions about the Holdeman Church. Yeah, so I'm trying to think. Oh, in here, one thing that happened was my uncle, well, some people would label him as a conspiracy theorist. And he also had some opinions, thoughts, stuff. He had information that he was kind of spreading out there, putting around, that wasn't really mainstream, right? He'd be maybe a bit more anti-vax, stuff like that. So he started kind of getting in hot water for that. That's, as far as I could tell, that was the big thing. I've talked to other people. There's a few other things that he kind of stood up to the preachers on. And, well, unfortunately, in that church, when you start standing up to them, that tends to be the beginning of the end. And he was nearing his end in that group right over this time frame. So I had never really taken much interest in it when someone was expelled from that group, because I was just kind of like, well, yeah, they must have done something wrong. Let's, shoot them and kick them out the door and we're good to go.
All right.
And I also probably wasn't super consecrated to the whole idea, if they want to put it that way. I was just kind of like living my life. But at this point, I had started to really pay attention. And so, I'd heard that he was really concerned about this. He didn't want to be expelled. He thought he was in the center of the Lord's will. And so I called him and I talked about it. I was like, well, so what's going on here, Uncle? Like, tell me your story. And, he told me, and it, he was genuine. Whether I agreed with all of his ideas, to me, is kind of irrelevant. Well, frankly, I didn't entirely agree with all of it, but it was like, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but can't we talk about it? Um, he was so distraught. This is my memory. He was so distraught at the time that he rear-ended. He was driving a pilot car and he rear-ended the tank in front of him. So he didn't take it lightly, and I was just like, this just feels like kicking someone when they're down. Like, it doesn't feel right. So I remember going to the members meeting where he was going to be brought up, being like, well, I can't stand when they bring him up. And I didn't. That was the only one, because it was only a matter of, I think, about a year later that I was no longer there. But I remember seeing basically everybody around stand, and the feeling of, the peer pressure basically to join this. And I knew that basically nobody else had talked to him. The preachers had, obviously, right? But very few other people had even talked to him or knew anything about, or his side of the story, right? So that didn't help me feel better about the church I was in. Yeah. So after that, I think, well, man, I'm trying to remember timeline here. I don't know if it was after that or before. I don't know if it really matters. But it was somewhere around this same timeline that my dad was also expelled from the Holdeman church. I think his was slightly after we had decided to leave. And he was kicked out basically because he stood up to the preachers in that congregation. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, the one guy he's pretty hard-headed, honestly, and my mom had went to them, kind of spilled her guts a little bit, and they decided they were going to call her on I think it was a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and they wanted to check in, got to check in, make sure you're staying spiritual or whatever it was. And that was just too much for her. She's a bit more of a private person and didn't appreciate it. And dad told him, okay, you guys got to lay off. Well, okay, we're kicking you out then. So that's what happened there. And so that was another one of those things where I was like, here's my parents. They need help. Like, they need support. Yeah. They need somebody to come around them and love for them and care for them. And, I can't, like, I'm up north. They were down in Ohio. And it's like, where's the care for the people? Right? Like, yeah, I struggled to appreciate that treatment that I saw handed to my parents as well. Yeah, so then I think it would have been sometime after that I went to school in Red Deer, carpentry school for my 4th year, and we went to the second church I'd ever visited that was non-Holdeman that I can remember, and yeah, they taught on sexual immorality, which was just surprising to me. Like, I had been taught in the Holdeman church that is something that does not get taught on outside of the Holdeman church. That's what I had been told. I don't know if that's like a common thing that everybody's kind of told, or if that was just kind of me, but that's what I had been told. And so when when my wife and I walked out of those church doors, we looked to each other and we're like, for me, that was like, you guys are always worried about deception. Somebody's deceived if they leave. Well, you guys deceived me. Like, I can't have proof more conclusive than this. And so for me, I was like, all right, well, we looked at each other when we walked out the doors. We're like, that's it. I don't think we're ever going back. And we never did. Um, I, at the time, we were incredibly worried about leaving the right way.
Yeah.
In hindsight, I wish I hadn't been. There is no right way to leave. You know, I think they expelled us for a foreign spirit or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was. You know, my wife was wearing jeans, so we were straight to hell.
Yeah.
Like that's basically what they had on us. I did go in for meetings and talked with them, discussed. I think I talked to the preachers twice, discussed my position, and they, gave theirs. I I kept recordings actually of the meetings because I wanted to go back and just see what was being said, because I I struggle with a lot of fear, fear of authority, and so I don't really do very well in those really confrontational situations. And when I went back and listened to the recording, it was kind of like I had suspected when we were talking, and the preacher was just going in circles. He would just keep repeating the same stuff over with slightly different wording. And I don't remember the exact scenario, but once I listened to the recording of one of those conversations, I was just like, oh, that's what's going on here. That's why I'm so confused, because it's like this guy's given me nothing. There's
Yeah.
there's no real conversation happening here. He's just trying to, well, baffle with bullshit, basically. So I don't know. That was, upon leaving and then looking back, that was another thing that made it really easy for me to look at it and go, yeah, I'm not going back to that. As I referenced earlier, I felt a lot of concern about being deceived. So one of the things that I had promised myself before we left was I'm going to go back a year later and look at it. Go like, okay, so what's is this really right? Having left, is this really a good place to be at? And if I feel like I'm genuinely wrong, I'm willing to go back. Say, you know what, I screwed up. I shouldn't have left. Whatever. I'm going back. Well, I've done that, and I've thought about it multiple times since leaving, and like I have zero questions that leaving was the right choice.
Yeah.
It's just the longer I'm away, the more wrong I see with that system, and it's just like I don't feel. The more I understand how it works, the less angry I am towards the individuals, and the less I appreciate the system. Most of them are just trapped, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And there's many good people, but they're trapped in a system that's just like most of those one true church systems are. It's incredibly controlling and hurtful. It hurts, it hurts us that have left. It hurts the ones inside worse, though, because I believe that most of them, and whether you admit it or not at the time, I think it hurts. The fear that you're being controlled with is so hurtful that it's just that pain, or that price is its own punishment. And I feel bad for them. Before I left, or around the time I left, there was another story. There was a older gentleman at the time, and his son-in-law, who he took me out on his boat, and ostensibly just basically to try to convince me that we should stay in the Holdeman Church. And we went out on the boat. We had a good chat. There's a couple things that stood out to me. I told him, I'm like, I don't have these big issues in some ways with the church, but I'm like, there's a few things that I feel like are just the way they are. Music, watching the odd movie, whatever. I don't have a problem with it. And the son-in-law was like, yeah, well, the radio still works in my truck. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, he was 5 years older than me at the time, maybe. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's kind of the issue, though, is that you're not really allowed to. Like, here you are, married man with a couple kids, and to me, that kind of sounds like you're living a lie. Like, I don't know if I believe at the time, I kind of told him that. I'm like, I don't know if I really want to live that life where I'm like, yeah, I believe in this, but I do X over here. Like, that feels like a lot of pressure on my life to me. So there was that, and I was like, okay. Then the older guy, he was the other thing I said, I was like, so John Holdeman, he was 21, I believe it was, when he left the Old Order Mennonites, I believe it was. And I was like, so I'm 22. Why does what I have to say in the church not matter? Like, and it's not just me that's saying some of these things in this, in our church there at the time, there was several of us that were more than willing to talk about some of this stuff and be like, hey, we don't think this is right. And I remember his reply was, well, I'm getting, at my age, I'm now starting to have some influence on the church here. I was like, yeah, I didn't say this, but I was like, okay, but you're not young anymore. I think he was maybe 60 or 50 something anyway, upper 50s. But tragically, I think it was 2 or 3 years after we had left, he died. And so that interaction has stuck with me. And I'm like, if you stay there, you might be very near the end of your life before you're allowed to have any real input into how that system works. Which I just think today, I'm not 20 anymore, I'm 35. And I still think that that's an incredibly flawed design. If the youth don't have any input, what kind of system do you have? You have an old man's game. And sometimes these youth, like they have some insight sometimes. Sometimes they have a valuable viewpoint. But that's not what's happening there. So that's just another one of those stories that I'm like, oh, that's really, it's really too bad. Another kind of story that ties in with some of that. I don't know how much I should share, but one of my grandmas, well, actually the one that left the Amish, as far as we can tell, we don't even know if this is 100% true because she never admitted this to anyone. Well, we know the first part, we don't know the second part. She had at least one child outside of wedlock. So she was Amish, she had a child, and gave it up to her, I believe it was her aunt, to raise the child. We found out recently, it appears that she also, the second one was probably not my grandpa's child either. this is family drama, but I think it's worthwhile to note that this is the person that caused my family to join the Holdeman Church. She had 2 children, as far as we can tell, outside of wedlock. She didn't tell the man she married, and she had him raising that child as her own, or as his own. He left when my dad was about 5 years old. He left the family and just disappeared. And until most of us didn't know this second part of the story until the last few years. And so we've always, frankly, I've kind of judged my grandpa as being, well, more than a bit of a loser.
Mm-hmm.
And now with the second part of the story, it's like, okay, so what was going on here, Grandma? And this is the matriarch that got us into this church, this system that has like a really, really hard take on the purity culture, on the way they treat people. They're shunning in some ways is, well, I don't know if I would say worse than the Amish, but it's pretty severe at times. And it's like, okay, so maybe she had some problems. Maybe this was a grandma issue that she was trying to solve in her own life, and not everybody else has the same influences going on with them. So that's been interesting learning later and learning about that. And another interesting thing that kind of influenced me with talking about my grandma is I remember talking to my other one. I actually lived at her place for, I don't know if it was a year, maybe. When I moved back up here, I would have been, I don't know, maybe 19 or something at the time. And I remember her talking about the head covering. And she admitted that she didn't really see the reason why she needed to wear it all the time. She was like, yeah, we didn't used to. We used to wear this when we prayed or when we went to church. She was like, I would often go to town without it. And she's like, I don't really understand why we have to wear it all the time now. But she was willing to submit to that. That was always kind of her thing, was she was willing to submit to that. So that was just another one of those items that, like, when we got into it, I was like, well, okay, so grandma doesn't really fully believe in her heart of hearts what this church is teaching. And so for me, that was kind of another one of those items where I'm just like, I don't think that I can stay in this group. So I don't know. I think that pretty much sums up what I had on my mind. Oh, there was one more thing, one other little note I had in here, and that was economic. I felt in that church that the options for as a young man starting out, that they were artificially limiting my options. I don't like, in some ways, like what I'm doing now, I could be a Holdeman church member and they would have no issues with it. But going to tech school for carpentry was really the limit of what I could do education wise to try to earn a better income, and carpentry doesn't pay that well, frankly. So that's one of those things that I looked at that and I was I was like, well, what if I want to invest in stocks or something like that? Like, I don't understand um, why that's wrong. So that was a little bit of something that's never really been a big issue, a big thing in my life today, but it was just something that was interesting to me. And I was like, well, why are these options not allowed? And specifically with stocks and bonds or mutual funds or any of that stuff, um, from that perspective today, it's like, well, okay, what about when you're 70 and you need a retirement? Like the pension that the US and Canada particularly provide for somebody are pretty meager.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty tough to live on that. So yeah, that's kind of my story. Um, not too much else coming to my mind right now.
Okay. I looked it up while you were talking. Voice of the Martyrs is still running. It's not a publication though. They they're selling a book right now, something about living with ISIS.
Oh,
But they're still a nonprofit. Seems to still be running. So
oh, interesting. Yeah, because I mean, I'm 35 now. I was about 22 when we left, so I don't know that
yeah,
I've had much to do with them for in that interim time.
yeah. Um, you talking about them expelling to teach a lesson? I thought that was really interesting. Um, my brother, he went in. He was 17, and he went in expecting to be expelled. Told him he had done all these things, and they said, "No, no, it's okay. We think you have grace. Just go pray about it." So I don't remember if it was several weeks, several months. He came back and he said, "I think I found grace," and they said, "No, you need expelled."
What?
Yep, it was just perfectly like you said, except just with one person. They held him in, and then once they knew he wanted to stay in, then they kicked him out.
What?
He's never been back though, so that didn't work well for him.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is that I think that's maybe even as much as anything a life lesson. It's that like when I'm going to control you by doing X, it often doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like in my case, it worked for what, 2 years, 3 years? And then
Hmm.
I started looking at it going, this doesn't make sense. So
Yep.
that for even for myself, it's like coming in with this tight-handed approach just really isn't helpful in life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I looked at the same thing with other religions, other denominations. I always thought that I always thought that the Holdemans had some sort of special monopoly on peace in their heart, on their belief that they were living the one true. And then I started studying other religions, and I realized there was almost every other religion also believes that they also hold something a little special. And I realized everybody thinks this. It's nothing special. So I
Yeah,
thought that was interesting too.
I, I do think that that's interesting. That like, uh, and I don't like Christianity at large kind of claims to have the monopoly. Like you can, I mean, and if you go like to Islam, they're gonna say, well, they're the right religion,
Yep.
and so it it's I'm always right, no matter where I am, I'm
Yep.
right, right, and it's like it's kind of a bit of a proud statement.
Yeah. Yep. Well, okay. I don't know that I really have any questions for you. I think you laid it out fairly well.
Well,
We're about 55 minutes in, so
oh,
not too bad.
that's longer than I thought I'd go without stopping multiple times. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you feel like you've said what you want to say, we'll probably shut it down.
All right. Yeah. No, I think that's about all I have to say.
Okay. Well, thank you for reaching out and for sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you giving us this platform. I think I think this has really helped me, even just sharing it, putting my thoughts on paper,
Yeah.
is really good. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. It is an honor to connect with our guests, and we wish the best for them as well as our listeners. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes. Our People can be found on all major podcast platforms as well as YouTube. If you are interested in sharing your story, please contact us at ourpeoplepodcastteam@gmail.com. Thank you.